This seminar series is part of an outreach by the ANZSOG Institute here at the University of Canberra. My name is John Stanhope. I'm a member of the Institute, and I'm very pleased to be associated with this lecture series. We have, until today, referred to it as the ANZSOG Seminar Series. We've, as of today, rebadged or renamed the seminar series as the Canberra Conversation. And I'm very pleased today to introduce Helen Watchirs OAM, the ACT Human Rights Commissioner. Dr Watchirs has a very long and impressive record in relation to human rights. Indeed, her entire paid working life has essentially revolved around or been associated with human rights. From her experience over 30 years as a human rights lawyer, working both for the federal government, its agencies, and from time to time as a consultant for the United Nations. She has been the ACT Human Rights and Discrimination Commissioner now for, I think, 7 or more years. I'm relying on my memory there. But in that time, as I'm sure you're all aware, has been involved in the investigation into and preparation of very significant reports in relation to the operation of ACT correctional facilities, both its youth detention facility capacity and its adult detention facilities, initially in relation to the Belconnen Remand Centre, which now, of course, constitutes part of the Alasdair Roy Centre, and more recently has prepared a detailed report into the extent to which Bimberi Youth Detention Facility meets the ACT government's aspiration that not just our corrections facilities and operations, but indeed all governmental operations in the ACT meet world's best practice in relation to compliance with human rights. I can say that in my previous life as Chief Minister, I made the boast, and I made it genuinely, that my expectation was that both Bimberi and the Alasdair Roy Centre would, through our adherence to human rights, the adoption of the Human Rights Act, be recognised as representing world's best practice, and that over time we, the ACT government, the people of the ACT, would say proudly that the Alasdair Roy Centre and the Bimberi Youth Detention Facility represented the most humane prison and detention facility in the world. And I look forward to Dr Watchirs' presentation on human rights compliance and detention and prison facilities in the ACT. Thank you very much, Dr Watchirs, for your attendance today. Before Dr Watchirs does commence, I should, and forgive me, acknowledge that the Ngunnawal people and their ancestors as the traditional owners of the land that we're gathered on today, and I extend to them my respects. Thank you, Dr Watchirs.
That's right. Thanks very much, John, for your very kind introduction, and thank you for coming here today. It's a real pleasure to come to the University of Canberra and be part of the Canberra Conversation. I will be talking about the Bimberi Youth Detention Centre and to a lesser extent the new adult prison, the Alasdair Roy Centre. I would also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land on which we meet the Ngunnawal people, pay my respect to their ancestors' continuing culture, the oldest in the world at many thousands of years, and the contribution they make to the life of the city Canberra and the ACT region. The Bimberi Youth Detention Centre was designed and constructed to reflect a commitment to the 2004 ACT Human Rights Act as well as the Children and Young People Act 2008, and to promote an environment where young people can be effectively rehabilitated. It's built for the future. It can hold up to 40 young people between the ages of 10 and 21, although I'd like to see the age be 12, not 10. But the majority of young people there are between 14 to 16-year-olds. The average number of people is probably about 20 There was a time when there were about 30 young people there for a short period when there was a change in the Children's Court magistrate. So young people are there in either serving a sentence or probably even more are there on remand. It's a new facility that has units, classrooms, music rooms, library, dining hall, health centre and recreation hall. I mean, it's so far above what the old Quarry Centre is, it's hard to compare. It opened in late 2008 and there have been a number of incidents, assaults on staff, young people on the roof. Not surprisingly, young people getting on the roof. I have to say, I think most correctional centres at some time have people on the roof. I know my young children used to love climbing on our cubby house roof, so not a big surprise. But these did get to very serious concerns, things about using restraints within the facility in 2010 and 2011 is when we conducted the audit and review. The Human Rights Act was amended and since January 2009 actually requires public authorities, very widely defined, absolutely covers detention centres, will cover private contractors where they're doing government work, to comply with human rights in their actions and in their decisions. There are at least 7 relevant to both children, young people and the adult facility. There's a prohibition on torture, cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment or punishment. Children and the family need to be especially protected. There's a right to privacy that shouldn't be unlawfully or arbitrarily interfered with, things like strip searches. There is freedom of expression, there is a right to have information about things like protecting your own health. And people in detention particularly have specific rights to humane treatment because they are within the custody of the state. In the criminal process, children have more specific rights than adults. They must be segregated from adults, and like adults, accused and convicted should not be mixed. And finally, there are special rights of minorities under Section 27 of the Act, whether they're ethnic or religious or racial, such as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Issues such as what happens during Ramadan. We've got a case at the moment about a man in the management unit wants access to cooking facilities because the cells are shut before sundown, so that's something happening at the moment. In January last year, the Commission commenced a joint review of the ACT Youth Justice System. There's a couple of copies. You'll see it's a very long 600-page report produced by 5 staff and 2 commissioners. My part was as Human Rights and Discrimination Commissioner looking at the conditions of detention, but the main carriage of the youth justice system was performed by Alasdair Roy, the Children and Young People Commissioner. We did a joint review so that we wouldn't duplicate and also that both focuses included human rights and a framework that was evidence-based and best practice. As I said, it is an improvement on the old Quarry facility. That was subjected to a human rights review audit in 2005, but there were challenges despite implementing a lot of that report in practice. That audit was performed in 5 weeks. I was given $20,000 and an extra staff member to produce that. This 600-page report cost about $200,000 in staff costs. It was presented a year ago to the Attorney-General and there's 224 recommendations, 37 very specifically on human rights issues and 57 that of course are general ones impacting on human rights, things like prevention and diversion, the staffing and management of Bimberi and the youth justice system, education, health and housing. They're economic, social and cultural rights, but they are included in the Human Rights Act in relation to impact on young people in their civil and political rights being detained by the state. The government agreed in principle with 189 of those 224 recommendations, very high compared to other jurisdictions' law reform reports. 29 were noted and 6 were disagreed with. One of those has been overturned by an Assembly resolution. The kind of thing that was refused, we repeated what we said in 2005, is that young people should only be criminally responsible from the age of 12, and that's come straight from the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. As I said earlier, 10 is the age in Australia. The government has been reporting regularly on implementation, and we've maintained a monitoring role. As at the 26th of June this year, the government stated that 120 recommendations are completed, 29 are substantially completed, and there's a further 62 to be commenced. We took the unusual step for the first time in, there's always a government response to any kind of report tabled in the Assembly. We actually did a response to the response, where we thought there may have been a bit too much wriggle room in the government's interpretation on that, and it maybe didn't reflect what we meant. But that's something to be sorted out, I think, when we see the results of what is called an integrated management system that's been started, and a blueprint for youth justice, which will be released next month by the government. Like the first audit, some recommendations were actually implemented before the report came out, and that's absolutely fine for the Human Rights Commission. We don't mind being beaten. The whole purpose is what actually happens on the ground to young people. So a lot of things happened very quickly after the report was tabled. Things like a diversionary framework happened the same month, July 2011, having Indigenous liaison officer working in restorative justice and circle sentencing. There's been a single case management model for youth justice and the care and protection system since September last year, and a trial the same month of a drug and alcohol court in the Children's Court, and also in October last year after hours bail service was established. That's really important with Bimberi because we have higher remand numbers there because of lack of alternative places, and those numbers we expect to drop because of that recommendation that's been implemented. One of the big implementation issues has been a youth justice task force. It was established the same month we presented the report to the attorney, and that's got government as well as community and experts to oversee the implementation of the recommendations. The key thing they're doing is producing a blueprint for youth justice as a platform and a strategic direction of what will happen over the next 5 to 10 years. In November last year, we actually held a youth justice forum at Yarramundi Reach to talk to the community and experts about how they could input to that task force in terms of their direct input and their understanding of what our implementation of recommendations really meant, and that was a very successful exercise. In May 2012, one of the biggest implementation actions happened. The ACT Strategic Board, that is all the Director Generals within the ACT, they meet regularly. They now have a committee called the Director General's Vulnerable Family Coordination Committee, and that is really central for a mechanism to have a one service response, that young people don't get lost between care and protection and youth justice, between housing and mental health services, that all directorates are involved in fixing the problem with young people that we as a community need to be responsible for. Another key recommendation was to establish a youth justice advisory panel of experts to advise the government, and this actually happened via a resolution in December 2011. That panel has met twice, and Minister Birch has confirmed that they will be providing advice on the draft blueprint, which is soon to go to Cabinet and is expected to be released and tabled in August, because that's the last sitting of this current Legislative Assembly. I do anticipate that that panel will look at evaluations of this blueprint, not just input at the start, but really take the carriage of that further, because I'm not sure the task force will continue. We're carefully looking to check. There's over 30 recommendations that the government response said will be fixed in the blueprint, so we're currently going through that at the moment. A central goal of the review was this shared community responsibility to embed the whole youth justice system within the community, so that it's not just a government problem, something that we all own and all work on. And one recommendation was the Legislative Standing Committee on Education and Training and Youth Affairs. Two things they'll be doing. They've accepted the recommendation, and that was implemented in November. That is having public hearings every 2 years on achievements towards the vision in the blueprint and the outcome for vulnerable young people, and also external oversight bodies like the Commission, Public Advocate, official visitors, that we report jointly and annually to that committee and I look forward to doing that soon. Another recommendation we ourselves are responsible is getting those oversight agencies such as the Public Advocate and official visitors together and share information on a monthly basis about what's happening on the ground at Bimberi. We all have different visiting schedules. The official visitor goes there the most regularly, then the Public Advocate, and we have probably the least resources to go there. And we update problems to the Directorate, and they've been quite forthcoming in addressing issues that we've raised. A good example, we learnt just before Christmas that there was a young woman there alone, no other female detainees. There were no school programs during the holidays, and we wanted to be sure that she was not going to be held in solitary confinement and that she would have things to occupy her time and that her mental health would be cared for in that substantial period. Another issue was that temporarily staffing levels fell. When staffing levels fall, human rights usually become a problem in terms of compliance, but that was a hiccup. There had been a big influx of staff with new recruits, and levels are getting better again. The Human Rights Audit has several key areas where continuous improvement is what we're looking for. Human rights aren't just something you measure in a snapshot. It has to be something that happens over time, and it has to improve. You can't go backwards. Key areas are use of force and restraints, behaviour management, searches, segregation, communication rights, that is, to the outside world, like families and friends. Discrimination, as I said, women and Indigenous young people can be the ones that get an even more raw deal in terms of their treatment because they're a minority within a small group. Decision making by authorities and oversight agencies such as ourselves, and very general areas like the actual degree of education that young people have there and the kind of health measures. Education's a good example. At the moment we can't provide for year 11 and 12 education. That has to be provided by distance with a Queanbeyan school, and of course they use a HSC system, not our own system. So if they go back into the ACT system, there is that crossover that will be difficult, but we are anticipating that the Education Training Directorate will do something about that soon. There are many areas where there has been full implementation. For example, amendments to allow strip searches for detainees is now only on safety and security, not good order. We were very unhappy with that in the Children and Young People Act, and now that's been taken out. Another one has been all uses of force must be notified to medical doctors and nurses so that they can check the young person's okay. I know there was a case of someone alleging they'd, well, I think we had evidence of an arm fracture that wasn't discovered until several use of force incidents later, and that's a really important recommendation. Other ones, as I've said, there's an information management system being implemented. That's a change management thing. It's a thing about keeping much better records so we know what goes on about use of force and other exceptional measures. And a big part of that is looking at the behaviour management system. What we found is that because young people didn't understand and decisions weren't transparent or explained, they'd jack up that they didn't accept the decision. But if the time was taken and if they knew what decisions meant and how they were reached, they were much more likely to comply with that. We reviewed that, recommended that CCTV areas be reviewed. There'd been allegations of things happening in the laundry, which was not covered by CCTV. You don't want blind spots in detention centres where bad things happen. And that's good for officers, not just for young people. It's to protect them from allegations that may be untrue. Footwear, big issue, doesn't sound much to us, but podiatrists gave expert opinion that both the youth and adult centres, that the footwear was very unsuitable. I think they were canvas and really needed something that is used, because you only get one pair when you're there. Funnily enough, when I went to Scotland, that was probably the biggest issue there, was young people complaining about the type of footwear they had, and something that can so easily and fairly cheaply be fixed. Phone calls, young people still must get them when they're being held on disciplinary charges or when they're being segregated from their friends in different units. And lastly, action bus timetable been changed. Now there are, I think, about 4 buses that can take friends and relatives to the centre at the time when there are visiting hours. Earlier the timetable took them outside visiting hours, which is just crazy. Other areas of partial implementation, we asked that use of force have a legislative change. That hasn't happened, but there is a change in practice, culture and training, although in relation to training we're still awaiting accreditation on the use of force rather than having non-accredited trainers. We wanted time out in a cell to be clarified when a young person is told to go in their room and they're locked in, that be included as a use of force. That hasn't happened legislatively, but I gather that policy at the moment is still working on that. We wanted a legislative obligation to report monthly on the number of lockdowns, that is when staff shortages, that people are locked in their areas and don't have as much access to programs. We didn't get the legislative change, but they have said the practice will be to record the time, reason and duration so that monitoring bodies like us can see what is actually happening there. We have asked that use of force incidents, that there be debriefing within 24 hours, and that is occurring, but only for unplanned uses of force, not where a person's been escorted with cuffs outside the facility. Restraints are still being used. They're calling flexi cuffs, which are a plastic thing between your wrists, a bit like you'll use at home on the top of garbage bags. I think you know what I mean. They've been classified as not being physical restraints, but in our view they are a use of force. The areas of most concern, there is one unit called the Quarry Unit. It's routinely used for general segregation and school refusal. In our view, that's not appropriate. It's really an area for people who are new to the facility, and you shouldn't be having people on disciplinary action, and they should have access to school, whatever unit they're in. We're still worried that strip searching is happening for court appearances. Under the legislation there needs to be a search only on suspicion, and we need to keep monitoring that. There's also a disagreement about whether young people are being allowed in their rooms when officials are searching them. They can be excluded if they're interfering. Young people are alleging they were not interfering, they just wanted to see that their property was being not defiled or lost, that they actually wanted to see what happened. And lastly, although Bimberi has co-joined cabins for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island detainees, in our experience they've never been used, and that's a central recommendation in the Royal Commission to Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. I'm going to talk now briefly about the Alexander McConaughey Centre that was designed using human rights principles, but we have not had the resources yet to conduct a human rights audit. So I can't say explicitly that it's fully in compliance with human rights units. We know there are issues with women detainees, there are problems in the crisis support unit for people with acute mental illness, and we are worried about an area called the management unit where detainees have been mixed with different classifications, that is both sentenced and remand detainees, and especially people under protection. There was an allegation of a detainee there being raped by an older sentenced man. He was in the AMC because he was convicted of a rape at the Belconnen Remand Centre, and he was in Belconnen Remand Centre because he'd been convicted of rape in the community. So in my view that is something that should have been avoided by not having this mixing of detainees. The Belconnen Remand Centre in 2007, 5 years ago now, we did audit, and we did anticipate that the new prison should have a pilot needle and syringe program to prevent disease transmission, particularly hepatitis C and HIV/AIDS. In our view, human rights are worthy in their own right for protection, but there is that additional and compelling reason that in a high-risk environment where harm minimisation is negated by making these needles and syringes contraband, that is a real public health problem, not just within the prison but outside, because of the fairly fast turnaround. I think it's something like 7 months is the average length of stay where detainees come in and out of the community, and that transmission can be widespread. Depriving a person of liberty is a very severe penalty, but it doesn't mean that other rights like equality, health and life should be unnecessarily curtailed. It should be equivalent to the community where possible. There are 3 of 5 national strategies. I'm on the Ministerial Advisory Council on Bloodborne Viruses and STIs, and these cover a 3-year period of what all governments, not just federal, state and territory, sign up to about what we do about HIV/AIDS, hepatitis C and Indigenous people. And they all say that state and territory governments need to identify opportunities for trialling an approach in Australian custodial settings. This is supported by international evidence demonstrating the effectiveness of prison needle and syringe programs. As I said, equivalence is a really strong argument. In the ACT, we have very successful community-based needle and syringe programs, and as the strategy said, there's lots of evidence around the world, not just in general communities, but a number of prisons do have successful needle and syringe programs. As expected, in May this year, the media has reported 8 cases of detainees contracting hepatitis C in the AMC. A further case, a person contracted it but cleared the virus, so that's not included. I do have a rider on that. Those figures are captured during voluntary testing. It could be an underestimate if mandatory testing was performed. I think it's only a matter of time because of this denial of access to clean equipment before we see a test case on possibly inhumane treatment by prohibiting this access. Canberra Times did a poll that closed on the 4th of July. It only had 264 people, but 59% were in favour and only 39% weren't. But I think it's the political deadlock with the CPSU that is the problem that needs to be fixed. There have been positive changes in programs, heating, staffing levels and lockdowns, and the complaints and disciplinary system at the AMC. We have a good working relationships with officials. We were included right from the beginning by John Padgett in the design of the prison, and since detainees were sent there from 30th of March 2009, we have regular oversight meetings actually at the AMC. That is not just corrections staff, but public advocate and the Ombudsman and official visitors. Under the Corrections Management Act, we've got the power to regularly visit there, and officers all the way up to senior management have been polite and accommodating of our requests that we see detainees at short notice. Things like we'll receive a discrimination complaint. It's Ramadan today, is that correct? Someone complained that they needed access to cooking facilities, otherwise they're not going to eat. And that's something that's being actioned fairly quickly. Commission staff do training on human rights law, often in partnership. That's really important that we don't just go there alone. We actually go there with corrections policy people. And the impression is that the staff do take human rights obligations seriously. And a message we always include, because we're aware of negativity about the Human Rights Act, that staff do have human rights. It's not just detainees' human rights that are protected. And the recognition that a lot of people are in the AMC because they have breached other people's human rights, such as the right to life and integrity of the person. They can make free phone calls, detainees, to us and other monitoring agencies. However, our contact through the phone has reduced over time because we can only take discrimination and health services complaints. We can't do human rights complaint. There's no power under the Act. We do note where there are systemic issues, things like if we get lots of calls about heating. In the old days, detainees were only given cotton blankets. Now they have doonas. I mean, it seems simple issues like heating, but it's bloody cold out there, I can tell you. I've sat in the general areas and it's been 10 degrees outside and it feels like 5 degrees inside. But that's the cell area. The small cottages do not have nearly the same problem. It's an issue of any building that's big is harder to heat than small ones. We do refer people to the official visitor and ombudsman for individual matters, and they're the main body that does that day-to-day work. We don't have the resources to audit. so I can't give an exact commentary on compliance. We did participate in the Hamburger review of the AMC, and we were successful in having their terms of reference amended. Initially it didn't have human rights there, and we thought that was probably their most central thing that they should be checking. The things we raised were issues about heating, extended lockdowns when there were staff shortages, the issue of mixing people in the management unit. People are there either under segregation orders or disciplinary orders. There was a big issue with people being under different regimes, 1 and 2. That's now stopped with the change of management at the AMC. The Corrections Management Act was actually not being followed for disciplinary matters. I do have sympathy. Those legislation has changed. It was very complex and very layered and not satisfactory from either a detainee or staff's perspective. Programs were slow to be introduced, but this has improved vastly, but it's still an issue for women because of the small numbers and people being in areas like the management unit or the crisis support unit where they only have an hour out of their cell every day and are not able to get to programs always. One of the media issues that was picked up was the women and children's policy. Been several pregnant detainees, but all have ended up giving birth outside the AMC and not been returned. But I do fear that there is not a practical possibility at the moment at the AMC unless a lot of work is done to increase the support that a woman with a child can have there. And possibly it may be that the option is to have to transfer to New South Wales where there are bigger numbers of women with babies. I think Emu Plains is the facility. But the problem there is that you're cut off from the rest of your family, and if you have other young children, then that's even worse. Although the Hamburger review was impressive, its focus was about operational matters, and I don't think it quite got there in terms of looking at human rights. What we're anticipating in the future is doing mini audits of specific areas of vulnerable populations. Probably women is the area we get the most numbers of issues with, so that would be one population we could do. And of course, Indigenous detainees who are overrepresented here, just as they are in other jurisdictions. The complaint handling system has we're fully consulted about changing that under the Corrections Management Act, but the detail really will be in regulations, and until we see that subordinate legislation we can't be fully satisfied, but I do anticipate it'll actually be better in terms of human rights compliance rather than the old system that we've had all these strict layers that meant that actually a lot of them were actually skipped. In the 2007 audit of the BRC, there was a mental health area called the D Yard, and I found that to be an extremely non-therapeutic environment. At the AMC, there is a crisis support unit, but as I said, I don't think that is adequate. We really need a secure mental health facility. We recommended back in 2007 that Quamby, the old site, be looked at as a possible location for doing this. Lastly, in relation to AMC, I did refer an alleged assault by the former superintendent to the Ombudsman more than 12 months ago, and we're still awaiting the outcome of that. One of the biggest developments nationally is the UN optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture, known as Acct, and that's relevant to Bimberi AMC and other places of detention in Canberra. It establishes a system of regular visits by independent experts to prevent torture and other forms of ill treatment. The visits are by the UN Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture, and Australia must also have what's called a national preventative mechanism. Probably that will be the Australian Human Rights Commission, but they need to coordinate local mechanisms for reporting on what actually happened. Australia signed Acct in 2009, and just last month the Joint Standing Committee on Treaties recommended that ratification happen quickly. That's a process of where all states and territories are consulted about ratifying UN treaties. So we're probably looking at later this year or early next year, and then there'll be immediate obligation for the subcommittee to visit. They don't need approval. They can go whatever detention facility they want to. They've got complete freedom of movement and conduct private interviews with detainees, much as we do now. There is a 3-year period for a regular system to be set up that is not just prisons but police watch houses, court cells and psychiatric facilities. We also think that the informal detention may be included, such as aged care and disability group homes and institutions, and that goes much further than anything we have at present. In terms of local inspectorate at the state and territory level, the model, the best practice model, is the WA Officer of Inspector of Custodial Services that was set up in 2000. Just about every other jurisdiction does not meet that model. They're not independent enough. They're usually part of the department. At a minimum, there needs to be every place of detention looked at in depth every 3 years, and then of course shorter ad hoc ones in between those 3 years. Much like our Bimberi and AMC and BRC work, we're really looking at prevention, not just individual complaints, looking at systemically how human rights conditions can be improved. Human rights compliance is not just fixed by buildings, although they're absolutely essential to avoid issues like overcrowding and inappropriate mixing of detainees and people who are sentenced. Human rights audits require governments to ensure that there is dynamic and ongoing implementation and monitoring, not just through laws, but policies, practices, especially culture and especially resources. And I know that's tough in a small environment. The AMC has more classifications in one facility than anywhere in Australia, and probably it could be said around the world as well. We try to review constructively and look carefully for evidence-based improvements for not just human rights compliance, but something that actually works. And it should be remembered that detention facilities are just the tip of the iceberg in the criminal justice system, and systemic reform is especially important in the youth justice area because it's here that prevention and diversion through care and transitioning can have the biggest impact. All the research shows is that there is hope for young people who do offend, that they are much likely to be recidivists than adults because of the way young people think, the way their brains operate up to the age of 25, that there is much more likelihood of spending your money wisely by investing in young people and the community supporting them to be part of the community and not to transfer as adult to the AMC. And I have to say, in the 8 years I've been in the job, probably the most depressing thing I've seen is young people I met back in the 2005 audit of Quarry now being in the AMC. Back then they were doing college courses, now they're doing university courses by correspondence, and frankly it's not good enough. I feel ashamed that our community, our systems haven't done enough to help individuals like that. Focusing on rehabilitation is extremely important immediately, but it must be recognised that recidivism rates are going to take a while to change, and of course breaking intergenerational cycles of offending behaviour. There are a number of families that do have a concentration of people that are both in Bimberi and the AMC. I'm very excited by the concept of justice reinvestment that was proposed in the Bimberi report, something that's been picked up by ANZSOG and several areas of the ACT government. ANU's got some seminars happening next month with experts from the US and UK where that model has been used. Justice reinvestment is about investing in intensive community programs so that we're not just spending money in the justice system. I'm not talking about taking away money from Bimberi and AMC. What I'm talking about is anticipating that we don't need another facility, that those populations will double. What we want is those populations to at least be stable, much better if they actually reduce over time, and I think that investment would be well spent, and I think it's probably one of the most important avenues to address huge issues such as the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the system. At Bimberi we saw between 40 to 50% of young people there were Indigenous. So thank you, and happy to take questions, but I think John is chairing. Excellent question, very difficult to answer. I think we know from the adult facilities that it is an actual opportunity when people are in detention to have their health improved, because outside people from disadvantaged backgrounds, particularly care and protection, they may be exposed to sexual abuse from a much earlier age than the general population. And while they're in detention, we can actually improve their health through counselling, through medication, and especially information. Particularly peer education models work well. I know at the adult level in relation to HIV, and I assume it would work well for young people. The issue of an NSP in Bimberi is probably more vexed than the AMC, and that's why we recommended a pilot in the AMC. Nowhere else in Australia looks ready to put up their hand for a pilot. Victoria is the only other human rights jurisdiction with their Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities, but in practice they don't even have condoms. The ACT was the first jurisdiction at the Belconnen Remand Centre to have condoms, and that was, I think, about 1995 or no, early 90s. So we're ahead on issues of condoms. We could be the first in relation to clean injecting equipment, but I think you're absolutely right, Michael. We've got an obligation for these young people to know about protections in terms of STIs and issues of safe injecting behaviour, although I'm comforted that it's not an issue as much at that age as it is in the AMC where it's rampant. Thanks, Zach. I absolutely agree with that. The issue of transferring young people from Bimberi to AMC from the age of 18 years old is a vexed one. A lot of young people we would recommend stay at AMC because, stay at Bimberi rather than transition, especially if they're towards the end of their sentence and will only be there for a couple of months. There has been an issue of the transfer of information between the youth and the adult corrections. So it's a different department. Community Services Director is responsible for Bimberi, whereas Corrections is responsible for the AMC. But our recommendations is that there needs to be a case management model where that information is transferred. We don't want privacy to be so overstated that people can't look after a young person when they come to a new facility, because that would be the period of most stress. And I know there were allegations during the review that young people were threatened with being sent on their birthday to the AMC, but in fact some we talked there actually said, oh great, I can smoke now because they can't smoke at Bimberi. Therapeutic programs are absolutely essential. It concerns me that they're not prevalent enough in both facilities. I'm hopeful that the Children's Court having that drug and alcohol trial will mean that those kind of programs can happen over, I think it's usually a 6-month period before they come back to see how they've gone. It is a really good diversionary system for young people with drug and alcohol problems, but when people aren't diverted, there's still the responsibility of the government to do something about them while they're in detention. I think that's probably one of the hardest questions we face. Quamby initially was a correctional facility, and then it became. I agree with it staying within the Community Services Directorate. I think care and protection, there's such a substantial number of young people in care and protection that end up in Bimberi, is that I think they've got the best opportunity to look after those young people. It's really the problem of the transfer from Bimberi to the AMC, and I think with the proper information transfer that can help, but I honestly think probably the culture of human rights is probably a bit more embedded in Bimberi than AMC, partly because of the size. I mean, there's only 20 young people odd there, whereas I think it's about 300 at the AMC, and a much larger number of staff. And of course, a lot of them trained in other jurisdictions, such as New South Wales, which may not be human rights compliant, particularly places like Goulburn. I think they're locked up from about 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon in their cells, which of course doesn't happen here. So, Emma, I don't think it's a conclusive issue, but my personal opinion is I think CSD is the right place, and I think the Youth Justice Blueprint there is going to be a really great plan for the future, and the fact that it will be regularly evaluated by the new panel gives me comfort as well. I think the prevention and diversion is probably more necessary for that, and the support for young people in the community so they never end up in the criminal justice system. I was aware during the review that there was a young person there with intellectual disability, and I'm pretty sure he was over the age of 18, but the decision was made that it would not be safe to send him to the AMC, and I absolutely agree with that. So I'm not as concerned about what happens at the Bimberi because of the higher staff detainee ratio and the lesser numbers, but I think it's an even bigger concern at the AMC about what happens to those people. There's been a Legislative Assembly committee on that Officer of Parliament role, and we did appear before that committee and did make a submission saying we would be happy to be an Officer of Parliament, but I think the Auditor General probably has a much stronger claim than we have to that. The advantages, if we were, is that currently our finances are looked after by the Justice and Community Safety Directorate, so they are responsible for the appointment of our staff, although we manage them. We pay about $300,000 a year for corporate support from the department. We prefer to be an independent agency. We prefer to be in a building that is not the same as the department. But the big thing in the AC generally is we have champagne tastes and beer pockets, so it was a concern to me in 2006 when we were forced to combine with the Health Complaints Commission, and that makes us look like a big wealthy agency with $3 million and 20 odd staff. In fact, I have 2 lawyers working on human rights and 3 staff working on discrimination. So 5 people is smaller than any human rights agency in Australia. Most have 10 staff, and only Victoria has a Human Rights Act. Of course, the federal has over 100 staff. Victoria has about 70, I think. So I think our work is constrained by our resources. Bimberi was a good example. An injection of $200,000 was given, and we could provide a comprehensive report. The hamburger inquiry costs the same amount of money. What I'd like is something similar for us to do the AMC. So watch this space, I think. Fred, that's probably one I need to take on notice. It's certainly something that was highlighted in the Bimberi review, that it seemed like a big hurdle to jump to actually get inside Bimberi in order to provide services there and then continue those services when the young person leaves the facility, so they have that through care and that continuity. As I said, I'm unhappy with the college level education being a distance one with the New South Wales system, but I have been assured that the Directorate is working on that. In terms of not just education in terms of schooling, of course there are other bodies like Youth Coalition and TED NOFs and other counselling services that are important. I'm not sure what the current state of play is in relation to that, so I probably need to check with CSD about how our recommendations are being implemented. Sorry, I can't give you more information on that now. I think that Director General's committee, where all agencies are represented, is probably a very good start about how that's going to go down through all systems, that one service covers all the kind of areas that a young person needs, not just in Bimberi, but of course when they leave. I think the the justice reinvestment model is the one I look to the most in terms of prevention. I know there are programs that police has been funded in high density housing that have had quite significant effects in reducing recidivism among some of those most disadvantaged families. So that's probably all I can add at the moment, Colin, but thank you for the question. As I said, it's a non-therapeutic environment, just as D-Yard was at the old BRC. There are some people that shouldn't be in prison, and if we had a secure mental health facility, they could be there and better treated. Certainly I know there are huge problems with the PSU accepting people with challenging behaviour, and I mean, that was front page story of a prominent Canberra person's child being back and forth between both facilities. That is really a disgrace. What he needed was support to stop his behaviour and to protect him from committing suicide, which is what his mother's greatest concern was. I am aware that Scandinavian prisons are quite different. I had two nieces staying in Denmark and Finland for year 13, and apparently prisons there are like apartment blocks just in the city. You wouldn't tell from the outside that they're any different to where other people live. In terms of how we get there, I think I've identified the issue with women, Indigenous people, the management unit, the CSU, but probably resources is one thing that could assist with building a human rights culture with staff. We only get to see staff when they're recruited. We could do a lot more ongoing training there. We could build better relationships. And I think, particularly with Acct coming into effect, I'm really keen to have an inspectorate system. We wouldn't have the full expertise, but I'm sure we could work cooperatively with consultants such as Professor Harding from WA to deliver a best practice mechanism for Acct that then we could measure and say whether we are the most human rights compliance jurisdiction, not just in Australia, but in the world. It's hard to make those claims. I've only seen prisons in Scotland and Ireland. Scotland is where Kibble in Glasgow. It's the inspiration for Bimberi, and I think it's carried that vision here really well. I also went to a place called Polmont near Edinburgh, which is, I think, the worst place I've ever seen. It had hundreds of young men under the age of 25. They all had shaved heads. It was absolutely freezing cold in summer, and it was just grey and dismal, just everything about it, and the kind of place you can't wait to get out of, unfortunately. But yeah, we took the inspiration from something that worked really well in Scotland, and we've avoided the warehousing of problematic young people. So, not sure I quite answered it, but I tried to.